All right, so 4.2 is mechanisms of population equilibrium. So what I was asking, does anybody know what equilibrium means or refers to?
Yeah. Like balance?
Yeah, excellent. Balance, right? So mechanisms just refers to like the means or how it happens, and then population balance. So basically, what are the things that allow for a balance for a population of a species in nature? Okay. Now, if you recall, hopefully, um, from earlier lectures, I talked about the population density and then the biotic versus the environmental resistance. The biotic potential stuff would increase population, allowing more to be born, and then the environmental resistance like pushes back, lowering the pop, and then it gets kind of a balance, right? So, um, so that's we're talking about kind of like those type of things that maintain an equilibrium. So there's two types of control, two categories of control for a population: top down and bottom up. Generically, top down is controlled by predation or the death of the organism. So top down typically is something that where an organism is being killed or dying off from something. Okay, and so we've got examples there. Obviously, predator-prey relationships would be, the prey would be being controlled by top down. Parasites, they can kill, depending on not all of them kill, but some of them can kill the kind of what they're preying on or their host. Overgrazing, and I have in parentheses for plants. In other words, for a plant population, if an herbivore is overgrazing that area, that's like, in reality, that's a predator prey. The plant is being preyed on by the herbivore, the cow, the deer, whatever. Like, no, it can't run away, but it's still a predator-prey relationship. It's being eaten and killed. So overgrazing for plants would be a top-down because they're being killed and dying. And then the last one there for top-down is disease. So disease, obviously, diseases can impact the population. So, like, not to be like really dark, but like if you think about what COVID, has done to the human. Now it's not. I'm not saying like, oh my gosh, we're going to become extinct or anything. Like, no, I'm just saying though that you see a disease that has uh, taken the lives of millions of people worldwide, um, and would be impacting population. Actually, diseases in general are, because as humans we don't really have natural predator, or any natural predators that we might have had, we've sort of outcompeted, right? So really one of the few things that has kept human population in check to any level is diseases. um, that's one of the few things that has kept our population amounts in check somewhat. All right, then the second category is bottom up. This is control by resource availability and biotic potential. Typically, I tell people that you can kind of simplify the idea into the idea that it prevents more organisms from being born somehow, or reduces the number that are being born. Okay, now there's some exceptions to this where organisms are already born, but they're dying off from a lack of resource. So, for example, think about overpopulation of deer or something like that, where maybe the population got really big because they had plenty of food that around the field, agricultural fields, they use that. But then when all of that gets cut down and goes away, um, the deer might start dying off because of starvation, because there's just not enough food around, right? So that would technically still be bottom up because it's resource availability. I mean, so I don't want somebody to be like, oh well, Humer said bottom up is only like not being, something not being born. But I just try to simplify. There are some things that can be exceptions, but in general, this is sort of like limiting the amount that's reproduced, like the population that's reproduced. Yes. So we have overgrazing for an herbivore, because that's gonna, like, if you sort of wiped out your food, your that could cause starvation, but um, it can also cause just a lowering biotic potential. They're not going to reproduce as much if they don't have as many resources and stuff like that. Um, and then under bottom up still, we have other sort of types of competition. Okay, so you can see in here, we've split competition into two different categories as well in the competition, into interspecific and intraspecific. Okay. The way that I remember the difference, and again, hope maybe this helps you, maybe it doesn't. I have a hard time memorizing stuff, so I try to find little tricks, but sometimes it doesn't work for everybody. Um, that's what I have highlighted here is inter has like the ER in it, and different has like the ER, inter different. So different species. Interspecific is between different species. So an example, a hawk and a fox both hunting rabbit. Two different species competing for some kind of a resource. Okay. Intraspecific is competition members of the same species. So intra ends with an A and same as an A. So intra is same. So example of that would be two male peacocks competing with mating displays for a female. So within the same species competing for a resource. All right. So how does this competition affect the species populations? Well, interspecific, okay, animals, it can affect the population size and distribution. Anybody know what distribution means? Yeah.
Sort of like spider spread.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so like how spread out, or over what area in terms of population we're talking about, like over what area they exist or live or whatever, right? So like how they're spread out. So in animals, interspecific between different species, it can affect the population size of the population overall and the distribution. For plants, it can affect the organism size, like literally the size of an organism. If you're, you know, competing with, if a plant on the ground is competing with a tree for sunlight, the lack of sunlight could actually cause the plant to grow less, be smaller, not as healthy, whatever, right? Fitness is the health of the organism. So that can affect the actual organism for the plant. All right. Interspecific over short-term time, what are the effects of it? It can reduce the success of species and even cause extinction. So, are any of you guys familiar with Asian carp, the fish? Yeah, a lot of you, yeah. So, for those of you that might not have heard of it, Asian carp is an introduced species, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here. But they can grow. They're essentially like the cow of the fish world. Like they eat a ton. Like they eat constantly, and they can grow huge. And essentially, there's no natural predators here, so they're out competing most other natural aquatic wildlife, the other fish and stuff. So other species of fish that are competing with the Asian carp for resources, so interspecific competition, they're getting pushed out, and um, they're worried that some of them could even be driven to extinction because they're being outcompeted. Some of the natural species and stuff. Okay, so that's kind of an example of how what that would look like. Um, Long-term interspecific competition helps drive natural selection. In other words, it rids the population of the less fit members, increasing the overall health and fitness of a species. So, long term, as long as the species survives the competition, over the long term, the members of the species who are not as well equipped to survive and or reproduce get die out of the population, and then the ones that are better equipped will be the ones that reproduce, and the overall health of the population of the species increases. Does that make sense? Questions on that? Okay. Intraspecific, competition within the same species. So how does that affect the species? In animals, it can affect the species' genetic health and fitness of the species overall. Um, it typically well, I don't know if I should say it increases doesn't necessarily increase genetic diversity, but it usually means the ones that are best equipped to survive and reproduce the most, and therefore their genes get spread throughout the population somewhat. So in plants, it also affects the species' genetic health and fitness, but it can also affect the health or size of individual organisms. So in other words, like if you've got, if you've got so think about like a dandelion, right? And it's got all the seeds, right? If all of those seeds were to just drop right at the base of the dandelion, then all of those seeds are competing with each other for nutrients, resources, sunlight, all that, right? So um, that would actually impact like how well, how big they can grow, how healthy they are, that kind of stuff. So here, competition within the same species can also affect the health or size of the individual organism. In animals, that really doesn't happen. I mean, the only way I was thinking yesterday that it could kind of happen is like if you're competing for a food source with members of the same species, ones that are not as capable at getting the food source might not grow as big, like as big and strong and whatever. So it could have a little bit of effect on the species, or I'm sorry, on the individual organism's health and size. But in reality, it's not, that doesn't affect it as much as it does like in plants and stuff. So okay, intraspecific. Over the short term, it can lead to density-dependent population control, territoriality, and self-thinning. Anybody know what territoriality is, or in animals? Typically, yeah.
Like where something like clones like breeding grounds like that, just like something they control.
Yeah, good. And territory, especially in animals, usually controlling a certain amount of like territory, or whatever, is usually about controlling the resources that they need to survive, and reproduce and all that kind of stuff, right? So we've probably thought about more common examples before. A male lion cub grows up, and they either have to challenge the head of the pride for control, or they have to go out on their own and find their own, like territory is, that kind of stuff, right? So territoriality, self thinning in plants. So if you guys have ever seen like a fruit tree, it flowers in the spring, and those flowers are then what creates uh, the fruit, the reproductive structure that is the fruit, right? Well, a tree, if it has too many flowers, sometimes it'll literally drop some of. When I say drop, it'll mean like basically like cut them off, or get rid of them. It'll get rid of some of them. It'll essentially cut them off and drop them, some of them, because if it kept all of them, then they're all competing for the nutrients, minerals, and water and stuff, and it would make the overall sort of like the product of that reproduction less healthy, not as big, not as good. So it does this self thinning where it like drops some of them so that the remaining ones can be focused on with the nutrients and water and all that stuff, and grow larger and more likely to reproduce and survive. So that's one example of self thinning. There's other ones as well, but long term intraspecific within the same species can lead to a shift in the gene pool of the population, changing which traits are most commonly seen in the species population due to natural selection. So, um, I asked the people yesterday if they had seen this example from bio, and they said they hadn't. I don't know if you guys have run into it. The Oh, I remember what it's the shoot. There we go. So the peppered moth. Um, so here's um, here's an image of the peppered moth, um, and essentially, hold on here. Okay. So what happened with the peppered moth is, okay. It says so. Before the Industrial Revolution, the peppered moth used to look like this. And what the benefit was the tree coloring in Europe where they lived had lighter whitish, kind of speckled bark, kind of like a birch bark or stuff like that, right? So the camouflage for the moth would help it hide from predators like birds and other, reptiles, stuff like that. It would help camouflage it and hide it. Well, after the Industrial Revolution, the coal smoke from the coal-fired plants had had covered the bark of the trees in those areas and made the bark really, really dark. So what happened was the lighter peppered moths stood out. And over generations, the peppered moth evolved to be more like this, like a much darker version of it. So that's like natural selection, because of environmental factors that changes the genetic traits of a species over time. Okay, so do you guys understand how that works or not really? Because yesterday they didn't really, but
I just had a question. Like,
yeah.
Would it eventually be able to go backwards then?
It depends. So, okay, so let me, some of you are nodding your heads yes. Let me just explain really briefly the mechanism of the evolution just so we kind of understand. So imagine you've got 10 peppered moths, right? And you've got them like lined out like from the darkest to the lightest coloring. So you're looking at these, okay, so now imagine predator comes along and you've got them on like our desks, which are dark, right? And if predators come along and they eat the ones that are most easily seen. So they eat the 5 lightest colored ones. Okay. The 5 that are left, the darkest 5, are going to be the ones that reproduce, right? So those reproduce, they create 10 offspring. Those offspring have the genes of those 5, right? So overall, those 10 offspring are going to be darker. Now, is there still some? So now imagine you take those 10 offspring and you rank them darkest to lightest. Imagine predators come in again and take the 5 lightest of those. So the 5 darkest that are remaining are the ones that produce offspring. Because so over time and through generations, you've got the darkest ones that are surviving because they're camouflaged better, and those are the ones that are reproducing. So your gene pool as a whole has a larger number of darker moths in it, and then those are the ones that are successful at reproducing, so on and so forth. Does that make sense? So to go back and answer your question, could they turn back? Yeah, it could, but it would probably take some kind of like environmental pressure that would make it more beneficial for the lighter colored ones to survive. Because you still have a range of moths within that genetic diversity of like the light. So you'd have to basically reverse that process somehow. Somehow it would have to be beneficial to be a lighter color, and then those ones would be surviving and reproducing. And then over time it would shift. It would shift back, but it would take some kind of a selective pressure to do that. So, does that make sense? Any questions or? Okay. All right. So that's the long-term, one of the long-term impacts of the intra-specific competition. All right. So last couple of things that I want to go through are on the back. So we've got 2 definitions here. We've got introduced species and keystone species. I'm going to talk about the keystone first because I want to spend a little more time on the introduced. Keystone species. Do you guys know what a keystone is in architecture? Like, remember the old like Roman archways, like they do the brick blocks, right? And it would do one of these dealies, right? Um, so wonderful drawing. Okay, so basically, what happened when they do this? The support for these archways is all borne by the middle, top center middle stone, which is usually shaped kind of like this. It goes in. So this stone, like the weight of all the or the support of all that is borne by that because it like as it curves, it kind of all presses in, right? When you put that stone in place, it like they're kind of like playing off each other, but it supports the whole thing. If you pull this, and importantly, concept wise, if you pull the keystone out, the whole thing collapses because all the support's gone. So keystone species are species in the ecosystem that are critical to the overall health and well-being of the entire ecosystem. They are species that if you were to remove them, they were to go extinct or get removed somehow, the ecosystem would be seriously harmed and potentially even collapse and whatever. It would have a sort of a chain effect on all these other animals, and you'd have deterioration of the ecosystem and harm to the ecosystem. They found out one example of this is wolves in the wolf population in Yellowstone. They had removed a lot of the wolf population in Yellowstone decades ago because of conflicts with ranchers in near the area. The wolves, having conflicts with them and their livestock, and so in trying to keep ranchers from shooting the animals, they removed a lot of the wolves from Yellowstone. Well, what they found out 5, 10 years later, or whatever, when they were kind of is that all of a sudden they started seeing all these problems in the ecosystems there. Their prey, the wolf prey population started exploding. Deer, moose, or caribou, elk, caribou. I don't know if moose are down that far, but all these different prey were populations started exploding, and then they started eating the living heck out of all the plants and everything else, which essentially was causing the base of the ecosystem, that producer base, to start breaking down and not being able to grow enough to support them, and so it was essentially causing the ecosystem to essentially like getting close to collapsing and stuff. They actually imported wolves back into Yellowstone, and they found out, and then they saw with less than 5 year period, all the ecosystem in those areas started to recover and become way more healthy. So that's an example of a keystone species. Okay, not all species are keystone species, but some of them are. All right, so let's talk about introduced species. Introduced species, as it says, are non-native species that are brought into an ecosystem, usually by human action, either by accident or on purpose. Okay. What time do we get out of here? Anybody know? I just want to know how much time I have to start it. 10:35. Okay. So I don't want to spend too much time. We talked about the Asian carp already, right? The So you guys have probably seen some of these. You might not know what they were called, but the Japanese beetles.
Oh yeah, they're those iridescent,
Yep,
right?
yep. They're all over the place
Yeah.
because they don't have any natural predators, and they're a huge problem. They eat all kinds of plants. So these things are Japanese beetles, um, and they don't really have any natural predators, and they get like all over. I remember in my old house we had like a wild rose bush, which a wild rose bush actually looks more like a bush, but then it has the rose flowers on it, and there were so many on them. They would eat not only the leaves but the flowers as well, and there were times when there were so many on it when you literally couldn't see the flower. It looked like a disgusting, like a mass of Japanese beetles, like a huge ball of them, because they were like so many, they were swarming over them, each other and stuff. Um, so that's a big problem. Yeah.
They're really hard to kill, like,
Yep.
very hard.
They're really hard to kill, and they eat a bunch of different things, and they'll kill it off because they eat the leaves like this, and they're really hard to kill, and they a lot of the methods that people have to use to get them, like they've got these bag traps that they use. They're called like
My mom used to use those. You put them out in the backyard, like spend an hour, you build them.
yeah they're like these bag-a-bug traps, like this. And yeah, I literally had this. See this picture? I literally had that happen once in less than 3 hours. These bags are big, like they're like this, like probably the size of a. They're bigger than probably it's a little bigger than the size of a piece of paper. Um, like the bottom part is or whatever. And so what happens is these attractions, the bugs get down and they can't get back out, and so it just basically collects them. And I had like this happened to me once. There were so many in less than 3 hours. They're all over the place. One of the negative things about this is you got to be careful with using these though, because the way that it attracts them using a chemical signal, like basically like a reproductive. It's like sending out a mating signal, like to get them to come hither, to get them to come. So, but you don't want to use one of these type of things if you don't have them very bad, because it will literally pull them from miles around. But if you already have them, really, then you might as well use it, because they're going to be all over the place anyway, and trying to remove as many as you can from your area is fine. But yeah, so they're a big problem. But they got introduced, they think, through transport of like raw materials from Asia, like wood transport and stuff like that on ships, and not like unknowingly being brought in on things like that. So yeah.
How do you dispose of one of those things?
It's kind of gross.
How do you get rid of that?
So literally, well, you can do that. You can beat it, but a lot, sometimes if they're still alive and you don't want them getting out, literally what you would do is, I think it's one of the suggested ways too, is you fold over the top so they're in there, and then you lay it out, and either on the yard or on it really works really well on asphalt, and essentially you let the sun cook them to death, and then I would just throw it in the garbage. But I will tell you, it is one of the worst smells ever, because I did that and then threw it like I double Ziploc bagged it. It was in that bag, double Ziploc bag in the trash can, and I had thrown it in like on a weekend, and the trash didn't come till like Thursday or Friday, and it was, oh my God, it was horrible. Like dead body smell is so bad. Yeah,
So, like, how do they get stuck in there then? Or is that just the
they can't. It's something about the way that they work. They can't fly up. Like they because the bag narrows. It's like it's like that. It's bigger at the bottom and it narrows, and it's something about like the way they get in there. They don't know how to either like fly up or